Okay, let's go on to the next control. The next control is going to be the slider. Let me close this window. I'm going to hit Control D to deselect everything. Double-click the magnifying glass and the pan tool to recenter my window. The next control is going to be a slider. Let's go ahead and add one now, and let's take a look at how it looks. Now the slider, this is one of the more complicated WPF controls. There's a non-trivial amount of code behind the slider to move the slider head to the location where it needs to be. If I edit the template of a slider, I end up with a whole bunch of new resources added to my project. Let's take a look. A whole group of new resources have been added, and editing the components of a slider can be kind of tricky, especially since the canvas is in a different location from the control and different pieces move around. So I want the functionality of a slider, but I don't want to use this template. So let me hit Control Z, and let me right-click my slider and tell it to create an empty slider. Well, when I do that, I end up with an empty box, and none of the controls that I put down are going to understand how to behave. There's no way for me to specify this is what my thumb is, so I want this to be moved around. There's no way to say this is what the range is, and that's what I want to move around. So I can't create an empty template either. So what do I do if modifying the existing template is too complicated and I can't start from scratch? I'm going to go back into the asset library, and over on the left you'll see the list of system controls as well as a tab for the simple styles. Let me click on the simple styles and you'll see a new set of controls is brought up. Among them you'll see a simple button, a simple checkbox, and so on, but I'm going to work with the simple slider. The simple slider is a slider just like any other control that you might use. It looks a little different, but the simple slider doesn't have as much additional functionality as the normal slider does. Now I added it and the result pane popped up for me. I'm going to press F8 to get that out of my way. The reason why it popped up is over here in the resource palette. If you notice, simplestyles.xaml was just added to my project. Let's expand that, and you'll see that the simple styles has a handful of properties built into it. It has border brushes, it has pressed brushes, and at the bottom, it's got all of my different simple controls. The simple checkbox, the simple thumb style, and so on. These are a set of simplified controls that you can use, and you can actually reuse these. They come bundled with Blend, so you have a second set of controls that are independent of the Windows Presentation Foundation and don't have as much overhead as the WPF controls have got. Now let's take a look when I right-click my simple slider and edit its template. Now when you're working with a standard WPF control, the Edit Template context option is usually disabled at first, and then I have Edit a Copy and Create Empty. If I edit the template, I'll actually be editing the template in simplestyles.xaml, and I'll be modifying my copy of the entire control library. I don't want to do that. I want to edit a copy just like I normally would. However, this is another way that I could modify the default for all of my simple sliders, and then every other simple slider that I add later on would inherit these features. So I'm going to edit a copy, and I'm just going to add this style to my window. Now when I press OK, I've got a template that's a little bit easier to work with. Now the top tick and bottom tick, these two properties work with the tick placement on a slider. Now what is the tick placement? I don't think we've looked at this before. The ticks show you small tick marks above or below the slider based on the given value. So let me select tick placement is top left up in the property triggers, and you'll see a bunch of small ticks have been displayed now above my slider. If I choose bottom right, it does the same thing, although below the slider. All those are actually doing is taking the bottom tick.visibility and setting it to visible based on the tick placement. So let me switch back to the default property trigger since I want to modify my default, and you can see that the top tick object over in my property inspector, when the visibility of the top tick is set to collapse like it is here, the top tick doesn't take up any space in the layout, so the slider gets all of that space. In this case, it's not wasting the space to a set of controls that isn't being displayed. The bottom tick control works the same way. The part track control, this is the main portion of the slider, which includes the decrease repeat button, the increase repeat button, and the thumb. Now, what are the decrease and increase repeat buttons? Let me press F5, and when I move to the right of either one of my sliders, as soon as I do a single click, it moves the slider up by a portion. What actually happens is that you have a button over that entire area of the slider that when it's clicked, it increases the slider by a given value. I'm going to close my application with Alt F4, and when I expand the increase and decrease repeat buttons here in the tree, you'll see the actual repeat buttons that are getting the click events when I click on either side of the thumb in the slider control in the application. Notice when it's selected, I have a very tiny layout shown to the left of my slider. Now, as my slider moves over to the right, the decrease repeat button will get wider, and the increase repeat button, logically, will get narrower as the slider moves over. Now, these two controls are there for the functionality of the slider, and in general, you don't really need to modify those. The one I do want to modify, though, is the thumb. I'm going to expand the thumb region in my tree and find the thumb control itself. I'm going to right-click it, and you'll find that the thumb is a control all by itself. I'm going to modify its behavior next. I'm going to edit its template, create a copy, and now I'm creating a new thumb style. I'm going to create it in my window. Now, if you think about this, the thumb can be styled independently of the slider. So if I have multiple sliders, I can actually reset the style of the thumb independently of the slider itself. This is a type of nesting of our component parts that's used throughout control editing to allow you to encapsulate different styles together. Okay, now let's look at the thumb. The geometry for the thumb is pretty simple. It just has inside the template a single grid with an ellipse in it. Well, let's do something a little more dramatic than that. Let's go ahead and zoom in on that area. Let's get rid of that ellipse, and let's put a rectangle in there. I'm going to convert it to a path, and I'm going to use my pen tool and modify it a little bit. Grab the direct selection tool and make a few more changes. Now I've got a thumb that looks a little bit more like maybe a puzzle piece. So let me come out of the styling for my thumb, and you'll see when I come all the way out to my main window, I've gone ahead and created a new slider that instead of a circle, I've got my little puzzle piece. And when I press F5 to run it, I can modify the slider by using that puzzle piece instead. Now I can go ahead and continue to make modifications on this control. Like for instance, I'm going to right click it, edit the template one more time. I'm going to go into the thumb, edit its template, and I'm going to add a quick animation to it. We're going to spin. Since I like to have controls spinning around periodically, I'm going to select my path, drop a keyframe at time 0, move up to time 2, find my transform property, open the category, and rotate it 360 degrees. I'm going to expand that all the way down until I get to my angle, right click, edit the repeat count, and repeat my animation forever. Then one last property, add a new property trigger, the target element, let's do it whenever it's enabled. So it'll effectively always be on unless I disable the control, at which point it probably makes sense for it to stop spinning. When enabled is set to true, I want to run my timeline. So now, press F5, and you can see that my puzzle piece rotates around, but even though it's rotating, it's still functional and I can drag it around.